welcome to this week's episode of the Oregon Minute. Today we are interviewing Candace Weidensee, Director of Student Services with the Oregon School District, who has been in the position for nearly 2 decades, but with focuses on special education and, of course, student services. She gave a presentation recently about mental health at the most recent school board meeting. So Candace, hi, and can you tell us about some of the things that presentation included for those who weren't able to view that school board meeting?
Sure. 2 decades sounds so old. We presented at the school board meeting the other night on mental health services. So as everyone is aware, mental health has been a big issue during the pandemic. We know that mental health concerns have been occurring on the rise, particularly anxiety and depression, really over the last decade. But it has kind of been exacerbated by the pandemic. We've had a lot more parental concerns about mental health because school wasn't in session in person the whole year, those kinds of things. The limited interactions with kids and their peers, all of that has created sort of this additional stress on students. So we've been sharing with the board throughout the year the kinds of things that we've been doing in student services to try to address that. And Monday night was sort of the culmination of the work that we've done during the course of the year.
And what are some of the most, if you could pick out 2 highlights from that presentation, what are they?
Oh, I would say that there are things that we can do about mental health, and there are things that we are doing. So we are doing a lot of social emotional learning instruction with our students, trying to help them learn how to be self-aware and how to manage their emotions and what to do when they're having a struggle. So we know that those kinds of supports through our SEL, through our positive behavior supports, really do help to address that. And really, a big factor is relationships. So we want to make sure that our kids are developing good relationships with the school staff so that they can feel comfortable and safe and supported in the school setting. So that's one of the big takeaways. We have been doing a variety of assessments throughout the year to sort of try to monitor student mental health and then to provide some interventions to address it. So our student services staff, that is our social emotional learning coaches, our school social workers, school counselors, and school psychologists, all as a whole have been universally working with students. They've been providing some small groups. They've been working with kids individually, and they've also been referring our students outside for additional help through our mental health partners. So we've been trying to address their needs, but we do know that this has been a particularly hard year for our students. And so the focus of some of our interventions has changed a little bit this year. So for example, where we might typically be working with students on the school rules and expectations and how to manage themselves better in the school environment, that has been sort of replaced with things like how to manage anxiety, how to deal with social isolation, those kinds of things. So we've been seeing a lot of students, we've made a little shift in what we're seeing them for.
And so when a student, and I would imagine, I mean, social isolation, I've heard studies that social isolation can have as dangerous of effects as smoking cigarettes. I've also heard in other studies that it predicts the longevity of life more than, say, like a healthy lifestyle, eating healthy foods, having that good, social circle is something that, can be a predictor of that. So yeah, I mean, when a developing mind is dealing with anxiety, depression, social isolation, I imagine that can be incredibly challenging, especially since we're all afraid to still go outside with COVID-19. So what are some examples of interventions that, say a student does express they're experiencing those challenges? What are some examples of advice that you provide and your staff?
Well, a lot of the interventions are with the student services staff themselves. So if they have a group of students who have the same kinds of needs, for example, anxiety or social isolation, they might make a group and then work through some things with them in a group. So for example, um, I've I observed last week Worry Warriors group, it was called, and it was a group that was to work with students on how to address their anxiety. The middle school has worked a lot on social isolation, as has Rome Corners. So they develop groups for kids who have the same sort of concerns, and then they work through some lessons together and practice how to use some of their strategies. Other things that we do are the zones of regulation. At the K6, we do a lot of zones of regulation. So that is knowing where your body is at and then what to do to get yourself back into a learning space. So they might practice some breathing strategies. They might take a break. They might do some of other things. But the goal is to sort of internalize knowing what your body is telling you, and then what can you do to fix it so that you can be back in a space where you feel like you can learn.
Can you tell me more about the Worry Warriors group and what they do to help students with anxiety?
Sure. So the Worry Warriors was just one example of an anxiety group, a group that is designed to help kids work through what is an anxiety that is within their control and what is something that is outside of their control, so that they're not focusing their attention on things that are, you know, really not things that they can take care of themselves. It's just an example of one of the groups, and they all come up with some creative titles and things like that. So it's not like Worry Warriors is a particular curriculum. It's just what that group was called at that particular building to address anxiety among the students there.
So early on in this conversation, I caught that there was an evolution of social emotional learning and how it translates to students in the district. And you said it's those focuses have become more, social isolation, depression, uh, anxiety, things like that. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how the pandemic has evolved um, groups, programs, anything surrounding social emotional learning for students?
Well, the pandemic really just kind of enhanced the problems that we were already dealing with, right? So we've been working on mental health issues for a long time, and typically we look at things from a tiered perspective. So we have a universal level of instruction and support for all students, and then we have the tier two, which is more of we have a subset of students that need a particular lesson repeated or a different direction or a group kind of a thing. And then we have the third tier, which is more of an individualized approach. So we've been doing that for quite some time. This year, we've had a lot of transitions. So we've got our PBIS structure, which is positive behavior supports. That those groups of people have done things like, how do you help kids get back into the building? What do they need to know about wearing a mask? How can they be safe with their peers in a line? How do they transition from here to there? Those kinds of school-wide behavioral expectations. That's been a lot of there's been some emphasis on that because we've come into school so many different times. So we've tried to provide that, but also then the welcoming environment. Everybody has had a connection with their teacher in a virtual way. It's a little bit different to have a virtual connection like we're having now than it is to be with your teacher in the classroom and then with your peers again in the classroom. So we've been emphasizing some of those relationships and rebuilding some of those things that you might do at the beginning of the year to create a classroom culture and climate. Those things have had to happen periodically as we've brought kids back in. So that's different, of course, than in a typical school year. And then the worries that kids have. Sometimes we've had kids who have had worries about their peers in the school setting. So for some kids, being virtual has reduced some of that anxiety and stress. For others, that isolation has increased their anxiety. So we've had both, and we've had our student services staff reaching out to make sure that we're trying to meet all of the needs of all of those kids. So it might be a virtual group, It might be an individual check-in with a counselor or school psychologist. Um, we've just it just changed the focus a little bit, so it's not, anything related to the um, school discipline. Like sometimes you might see your school counselor if you needed to work on behavior in your school discipline kind of scenarios. This year it hasn't been school discipline. It has been more of those other uh, lack of social opportunities kinds of things. So we've had counselors that have done a lot of they've done a lot of creative ways to try to make virtual groups available to help kids to socialize and create some spaces for that to happen even virtually.
Yeah, I can't imagine setting up a guidance counselor appointment for parental matters.
Yeah, it's a little trickier for sure. Yeah.
So, as director of student services, did you ever envision, and maybe this question has an obvious answer, did you ever envision that these would be, um, having to pivot in this way to serve students in this way amid the pandemic?
Well, honestly, I've been in the job long enough that we had a few years back the idea that there could be a pandemic coming. I want to say H1N1 maybe was um, the bug at the time, that there was a lot of concern about whether or not that was going to become a pandemic, and it didn't. So since that time, though, we haven't really been in a frame of thinking about what would we do if there were a pandemic. We haven't really been planning for it in that way. So definitely this was a more unexpected kind of a thing, and then it happened so quickly last spring that when we had to shut down, then we had the summer to plan, and we had to go through a variety of stages of planning. What do we need to do to bring kids back in the healthiest way we can? And we had planning sessions all summer long, thinking that, this is how we will respond if we are back in person. We had to shift gears a few times. And so it has been a lot of planning on the part of the student services staff themselves in terms of really, what is the best way to manage this so that our kids are getting the services that they need, and they're coming back as healthy as they can.
And so coming back, I think, is a huge theme right now. Getting students back in school, reopening. How does all of this translate post pandemic? All of these services.
That's a great question. They'll all still be here. They might, instead of being a virtual session with a group, they might be meeting in person. There'll be some reorganization in terms of schedules. So some of that will be disrupted and reconfigured and all of that kind of stuff. But for sure, the student services staff are still here, and they're still available to work with all of the students that they've connected with. And then in addition, they'll be watching to see, who's really struggling with coming back, who needs the supports with just, kind of getting back into the routine of being with peers again, and how does that, how are kids adjusting to that? So there will be student services staff that are keeping an eye on everybody as they return to full days.
Um, well, Candace, I think that concludes all the questions that I have. I'm wondering if there's anything that you would like to discuss that I have not brought up during today's episode.
Oh, well, I would just say that, I would just give a shout out to the student services staff. Every single one of them has been working above and beyond to try to meet the needs of all of our students. And really what we hope to do is to continue to make sure that kids are getting what they need. And so if there's anything that's come from the pandemic that is positive, it's perhaps that we've talked more about normalizing mental health needs, right? So if we can normalize the idea that things are scary sometimes and they make you nervous, and it's okay to ask for help, then we've done, that's a big thing. If we can reduce the gap between those who need services and those who are getting it, I think we've done something. And if we can keep working, and we will keep working on those social emotional skills so that kids can not just learn the material to give it back to you, but to actually be able to integrate that learning so that they can respond more healthily when they run into something that causes them worry or sadness. So it's really is about supporting the whole child, as our board values indicate, and making sure that we're providing safe and supportive spaces for all kids to learn. And that includes really the importance of knowing yourself and being able to work through problems in a healthy way.
Yeah, it's so hard during the pandemic right now. I'm so ready to be able to go out in public again. I imagine you feel the same.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Candace, for coming on the show today, and to all of our viewers, thank you for watching. And as always, we have episodes every Thursday at 7 p.m., so don't miss out.